Hello, and welcome to Storybridge. I'm your host, Patty Lucia, and I'm a teacher and author, and I want to help you use the power of story for personal growth and healing. Every week we feature stories based on the commemorative days of the month, or my own musings about the power of story. In the following episode, I explore the gap between our authentic lives and the stories we tell about them. Have you ever wondered about the differences between the story you are living and the life story you share with others? What are the parts we leave out, and why? Does that story we tell, the cleaned up version, begin to affect the life we're living? How does this gap between the life we are living and the life story we share affect us emotionally, spiritually, and physically? Have you ever thought about the things in your life you keep secret? Thoughts, beliefs, things you may be passionate about, desires, dreams. Are these not part of our stories too? I'll go even further and suggest that it is possible that the very things we leave out of our stories are the things related to our core self, our essence, our soul, the very reasons we came into this life in the first place. This condition, the condition of a dual existence between one's core self and the outer expression of self, exists on a micro individual level and on a macro societal level. This disparity between our essential truths as individuals and collectives and our expressed stories may be one of our deepest wounds. Could it be that one of the reasons so many of us are anxious, depressed, and addicted? Could it be a contributing factor to our violence? But why do our individual and collective stories need so much editing? And for whom do we edit? Whether our circle is small or large, we are always editing our story for someone's approval. We learn early that refusing to edit could possibly cost us our family, friends, and professional peers, anyone from whom we seek approval and acceptance. How do we learn what stories are most acceptable? Is there a canon? It turns out there is. It turns out that the most acceptable stories are those that present the least amount of change. Here's an example of a highly acceptable story. A young boy says, "My dad is a fireman, so I'm going to be a fireman." This story gets high approval ratings from family and community. The "my dad is a fireman, so I'm going to be a fireman" story will be repeated by family and community members. The "Johnny is going to be a fireman just like his dad" story may spread throughout the community. Johnny may see an adult stranger in the community who reinforces the acceptability of this story. "I heard you are going to be a fireman just like your dad." Johnny's story is acknowledged by family and community members. People are proud of Johnny. But what if Johnny's story is, "My parents want me to be a lawyer, but I want to be an activist"? This story may not get the same approval. In fact, Johnny may pay for his honesty, for his authenticity, for his desire to write his own story. Further, his story most likely will not be repeated with pride at the barbecue or in church. Johnny will quickly learn to associate shame with writing the authentic story of his life. Let's consider a young woman whose family is anxious for her to wed and bring them grandchildren. She may be inclined to withhold her story from her parents if, in fact, her true story is about her love and devotion for another woman. In this case, in the young woman's silence, the family tells their daughter's story for her by imprinting their own desired story. She's going to make such a good mother, they may say. She just needs to find the right man. The young woman is not saved by her silence, but instead her story is written for her. The story her family tells for her is the accepted story, the repeated story. She is faced with the choice to either keep her story a secret or confront the challenge of contradicting a story that has been already accepted as true by the broader audience of family and community. So we learn at a very young age which stories are met with approval. In fact, the approval spectrum is quite narrow. A young person must learn to navigate family expectations, community expectations, church expectations, and school expectations. Each one of these powerful institutions help create the funnel through which each generation of children is moved. Even today, it is a rare parent who encourages their child to write their own story according to the life they choose to live, the religious or spiritual practices they choose to follow, the education and career choices they want to pursue, the politics they choose to embrace, and the kinds of relationships they wish to have. These rare parents may find themselves defending their children in church and at school, in their extended family and community. Some young people whose stories are in conflict with the stories their families would find acceptable make the courageous decision to set out on their own. While this may seem like a perfectly reasonable option, it is in many ways a lose-lose scenario because the trauma caused by such a separation from family leaves these courageous storytellers bruised and vulnerable. In contemporary times, they are more likely to fall victim to drugs, alcohol, and suicide. Let's take, for example, a young gay man who decides he must leave home in order to live his authentic life. His family is outraged and angered that he has left his home and blame his lifestyle for such a terrible decision. They do not see that from his perspective, it was the only decision that would allow him to write his own true story. The family may see it rather as an abandonment of them. So, in return, he and his partner may not be welcome at family functions or for the holidays. The price, according to his family, he must pay for such a wayward decision. This kind of rejection from a fundamental source of support makes this young man more vulnerable to abusing alcohol and drugs. And if he succumbs, his addictions are further evidence in the eyes of his family of the destructive lifestyle he chose. His story is being written for him by those who know little about his actual life outside the judgments they hold. Further, if he has the opportunity to tell his story to family in the future, unless they have come to accept him and his lifestyle, he will most likely be regarded as an unreliable narrator of his own story. This is how acceptance and approval on a micro level causes us to edit our stories, or worse, not tell them at all, leaving a story void. But as you know, voids never remain empty. In the case of story voids, they inevitably are filled by stories written by others. In my book, Wildflowers in Present Tenses, I share a story about a woman I had fallen in love with. I wanted to marry her. I would have had children with her, but this, as it turned out, was a fantasy story I was writing about our relationship. You see, she had been raised as a Seventh day Adventist. Her family, her church, and her community were paramount, and consequently, our relationship was a complete secret. No matter how much she loved me, she could not leave these vital parts of her life behind. Now, romantics might say if she really loved you, she would have made a life with you. But here is the part I came to understand. If she had made the choice to leave all of that for me, a choice that would have resulted in being erased from those vital places, family, church, and community, would it not have destroyed her and ultimately us? Although tragic, it was best for both of us that our story end. Human dynamics on a micro level are usually expressed on broader macro levels of society and the world. What are understood as acceptable stories and non acceptable stories in the global narrative determine which human experiences or stories get expressed. Everything outside this approval funnel is either edited or left out. The canon controllers on the macro level are less visible than the micro controllers and more often more shadowy. Recently, I observed a surprising shift in what is considered acceptable storytelling on the macro or global narrative level. The shift happening at this very moment is a shift to the acceptability of UFO stories. Now, for 8 decades, any story about this phenomenon was relegated to crazy tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theory. It didn't matter how much evidence was produced, these stories were not allowed, not acceptable, not approved. If we try to imagine the amount of disapproval, ridicule, and pushback piled on anyone who came forward with such a story in the last 8 decades, we would still not come close to understanding the experience many of these ordinary humans endured, simply because they had had an experience and wanted to tell their story. So, suddenly in 2021, we have been given a sort of permission to tell such stories. What caused this shift may be a mystery for decades to come, much like centuries ago when the church lifted its ban on any stories which did not place Earth at the center of our universe. This shift came a little too late for Galileo, who spent the latter part of his life on house arrest for his heretical observations of our Earth traveling around the sun. Observations which challenged the global narrative of the time. Even today, the scientists most likely to be published in our esteemed scientific publications are those whose work does not contradict the current acceptable narrative of Earth, climate, and cosmos. I have a personal relationship to a story on the topic of UFOs, and I published this story in Wildflowers and Present Tenses. It involves a story of Betty and Barney Hill, a couple who became the first documented alien abduction story in our country. In 1961, Barney and Betty lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and had an encounter with a spacecraft and the beings inside one late night while traveling back from Canada. They had no memory of this experience, but after a series of dreams and flashbacks, underwent hypnosis and in the process revealed an utterly compelling story. Their story was in fact fully investigated and vetted by the United States military. Despite the Hills' attempts to keep their story from the public, it was leaked from the Boston office of the hypnotist, and Barney and Betty found themselves in the middle of a media circus. They arrived home one day to find news trucks and cameras on their front lawn. They moved in with family members. They wanted no part of the media attention. After all, Barney and Betty Hill were a biracial couple living in a predominantly white state and had, up until this point, lived a quiet life. In 1987, I met Betty Hill while doing political work in Portsmouth. The full story of this thought provoking encounter with Betty Hill is recounted in the story Torches in my book. After inviting me in and signing my petition, Betty answered all the questions that were swirling around in my young mind. I was captivated by her story, and there was nothing in her behavior that seemed crazy. In fact, what Betty shared with me that evening, I have remembered over the decades and hold it as a rare and precious wisdom about the importance of free will and respecting all life in the universe. So in October of 2004, while driving home from my teaching job in Florida, I heard radio personalities talking about Betty Hill's death. To my disappointment, Betty Hill was the butt of their alien and UFO jokes. I decided to call into the station and share my story about meeting Betty Hill in 1987 with hopes that I could inspire them to view her with more respect. What I remember most about that call was the DJ's words, "Well, you seem like a normal, intelligent woman, but..." I could not change the fact that the most accepted and approved stories on this topic were stories that portrayed these people who claimed to have such encounters as crazy. Now, in the spring of 2021, as the narrative shifts on these stories and the light of acceptance and approval begins to shine on them, I wonder if the countless people like Betty and Barney Hill will finally be vindicated. That may take a while. In 1633, Galileo was forced to recant his newly discovered story that the earth revolved around the sun and not the other way around, that the earth was not the center of the universe. He was forced to recant because his story contradicted the global narrative of the time. And even though stories about the earth revolving around the sun became acceptable just a few decades later, it took 359 years for Galileo to receive official vindication. So, why does any of this matter? So long as a gap exists between our authentic stories on both a micro and macro level, humans will live their lives, both individually and collectively, out of step with our deepest truths, dreams, and desires, out of step with who we really are, out of step with our very soul. This disharmony may be at the core of our emotional, psychological, and spiritual troubles. This kind of disconnect with one's deepest self and the effects of such a disconnect reminds me of that famous poem by Langston Hughes. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? Both the edited and unedited versions of our stories have the power to shape our thinking, determine our actions and decisions, and ultimately create our lives. How to navigate the waters of approval and acceptance is our own personal journey. A starting point in closing the gap between our authentic story and the one we tell is to ask ourselves, what is my story? The story I would tell if no one was listening. Then ask, how shall I cultivate the courage to tell it? This is Patty Lucia. Thanks for listening. If you would like to share your story on StoryBridge or buy my collection of stories, Wildflowers and Present Tenses, or if you'd like help writing your story, please visit my website, pattyluciawrites.com. Thanks for listening.